Governor Evers announced 220 pardons today, marking more than 2,000 pardons since he took office. The governor can pardon someone convicted of a crime, restoring some of the rights lost when a person is convicted of a felony. Pardons do not expunge court records. People on the state offenders registry are not eligible for pardons. Governor Evers said those that he has pardoned have put in the effort to rebuild their lives.